So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the seminar series at Rail Live. Thrilled to be chairing this first session. So, very, very shortly, I'll be handing you over properly to John Larkinson, the Chief Executive of the Office of Road and Rail Regulation. He's been full-time Chief Exec since March 2021, but interim since 2018, so over 4.5 years in the role. PR23. This is all around setting out or scrutinising what it is that Network Rail are going to deliver on in terms of operation, support, maintenance and renewals. It's pertinent to every single one of us within supply chain, obviously with that focus on the customer, who our customer is, freight or passenger, and then wrapped around all of that, the importance of environment, as in our impact on the environment and its impact upon us. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to John. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. And hello, everybody. It's really good to be here. Nice to see everybody. And it's nice to actually be at this whole event. I'm just having a quick wander around, and it's always a really, really good atmosphere. So it's a great place to come to. So I'm John Larkinson, Chief Exec of the LRR. Can I just do one bit of marketing right at the start? And we've got a stand, M30, literally turn left out of here. If anybody wants to go to it, we've got a team there, always willing to help and have a chat. And I'll be there a bit myself as well later on. So it'll be really good to see you. So in terms of what I'm actually going to talk about, so the title's PR23, and I'm going to talk a bit about that because one of the crucial things about a periodic review, it sounds a bit technical, it sounds a bit obscure, but basically what it does is set Network Rail's funding and outputs for a 5-year period. And if you're in the rail industry, that's giving a high degree of certainty about 5 years. Not a lot of industries get that 5-year certainty. So in that sense, for the supply chain, for people working in the industry, the periodic reviews are really, really important. So not just Network Rail, but for everybody. So I want to talk a bit about that. I want to talk more generally about train service performance. Train service performance has not been good recently. It's been declining for about a year. I want to talk about that. You've probably heard a lot about rail reform. We've got a session about rail reform later. I'm going to say a few words on that. You may or may not know that one of the things we do, we're a competition authority. So we do competition studies, and I want to talk about a new study we're doing at the moment. I'm not going to talk much about safety because tomorrow my Chief Inspector for Railways, Ian Prosser, is giving a talk on safety, so I'm only going to mention it in passing. And I was trying to think about the title where it says, it talks about PR23 and beyond. I was trying to think what the beyond bit might be. So I didn't choose a title, by the way. So I was going to talk a little bit about how LRR has changed over time and how we're going to change in the future. So that's the plan. That's what I'm going to cover. So make a start. So the first one, PR23. So just where are we in this process? It's a process that decides Network Rail's funding and outputs for the period 2024 to 2029, a 5-year period. And it's for what's called Control Period 7. So we're currently in Control Period 6. We're going to go into Control Period 7. So where are we? So the government has decided in England and Wales and Scotland, because there's 2 separate funding decisions, because Scotland's got a separate funding deal, the government's decided how much money they're going to put in. Once the government decides how much money they're going to put in, Network Rail produces what's called a strategic business plan saying what they're going to do with that money. That's how it works. Then we assess that strategic business plan and say whether we agree with that plan or not. So that's the stage of the process we're at because we just published our draft conclusions on it. And they're out to consultation now. So if you've got a view, please respond. So at a high level, I'd say Network Rail's done a good plan. Network Rail have to decide what to prioritise. I think overall they've done a really, really good plan. If you look at some of those, some of the key areas that we're interested in, like efficiency, Network Rail's currently doing a really, really good job on efficiency, and they've got some really good plans, ambitious plans for the future. So that's good. There's 2 areas where we don't agree with Network Rail, and that's about the level of ambition about train service performance, how many trains are actually on time. And the other is about what are called core assets. Core assets, I mean things like signalling, tunnels, structures, and about the amount of money being spent on them. And they're 2 of the things I'm going to come back to over time. I just wanted to mention this point about risk at the bottom. I mean, there's obviously loads of risks on the railway. There's safety risks, etc. You've got risk of industrial relation problems, which is here and now. But you've also got one massive risk, which you'll probably recognise from everyday life, which is inflation. Network Rail's costs go up too. And at these levels of inflation, it's really, really difficult to predict exactly where we are in terms of future costs. So that's going to be a tricky area over time. But I want to start first with just some numbers. So this is the money that Network is proposed to spend over that 5-year period, 2024 to 2029. So if you look at the bottom line, total expenditure less EC4T. So EC4T is basically the electricity that Netrail purchases to run the trains, electric trains. So we're taking that out because it's not under Netrail's control, really. And if you look at that total number, so in the current control period, CP6, compared to the future one, there's an increase in funding from the government. That's actually pretty good news in the current economic climate. I take that as pretty good news overall. But what's happening within that? Well, if you look at that core renewals line, core renewals are down by about 11%, and that's the thing I want to come back to. If you look at some of the other lines, maintenance spend's up. Now, maintenance spend's gone up for various reasons, but one of the reasons why maintenance spend is up is if you're reducing renewal spend, you're potentially increasing risk. And you've got to find some way of mitigating that risk, and the mitigation is going to come through increased maintenance. So that's the sort of safety angle in all this. You know, it's all got to balance out at the end of the day. So what we're seeing here is we're seeing Network Rail basically cutting core renewals. Maintenance spend is going up. The overall settlement is broadly positive. And I'm going to come back to these points. So I'm going to move now to performance, though, because I said now one of the two things we're not convinced by in terms of Network Rail's plan is the plans on performance. Now, before I go into this, it's not easy to forecast future train service performance levels. If you look at the history of all the forecasts that have been done, then you look at the outturn, not many people get it right. So now let's not fool ourselves that this is easy to forecast. Also, if you look at some of these measures, like on time, percentage of trains on time, not all these are fully within Network Rail's control, because it's also about what the operators do. But just to sort of pick out one area where we didn't agree with Network Rail, take that on time line, first row up there. Network Rail presented its performance targets as a range, quite a big range, 65.2 to 67.5. The bottom of that range is below even the current performance. I mean, putting technicalities to one side, we don't think that's an acceptable ambition for the level of the financial settlement Network Rail's got, and for their ability to cooperate with train operators to do more. So that's one area which is under debate. If you take a different one, Scotland performance measure, because the PR review settlement is different for Scotland, England and Wales. The Scottish Government have devolved powers. Scotland can set its own targets. So the Scottish Government has chosen to set its own targets. We're not setting them. They said, we want these targets. 92.5% of trains on time using the Scotland performance measure. That's a different measure. That's never been used before. It's a bit like PPM, for those of you who have been involved in these things, but it's subtly different. But that's something where effectively the government it basically said, this is what we want. That is a hugely ambitious target. So that's another difficult area. Can Network Rail actually get to the target that was being set by the Scottish Government? The Scottish Government set a highly ambitious target for the last 5 years. Network Rail has not been able to get there. So there's quite a few things up in the air there around train performance. I'll come back now to this, what I said about core renewals. What do I mean about increased focus on core renewals and why? What we've got out there on the railway, and it's well known, is that we've got an ageing asset base. A lot of these assets were built a long time ago. They're vulnerable. They're gradually getting worse. They're degrading. There are potential safety risks. So we've gone through the plan by both asset type and by region. Network Rail split into regions. And we basically pinpointed the areas where we think Network Rail needs to spend more money. So if you look at that bottom row, the total, just to get an overall feel, what you're seeing is structures and earthworks are the two areas which we've really focused on. Now, you might think to yourself, well, hang on a minute, if the total funding from the government is fixed and you're telling Network Rail to spend more money somewhere, where are they going to get it from? So we've looked at some of Network's areas of spend. We looked at some specific priorities, some areas where there might be further efficiencies. And we basically said, we've identified a pot, we think, of 800 million where you could get it from. So an example of that is West Coast Main Line North. Network Rail, it's a very sensible plan. They say, let's get ahead and do some track renewals before HS2 is done. So when the HS2 trains come off the high-speed tracks, the conventional tracks are in good shape. I mean, it's a good idea, but we just don't believe that Network Rail are actually going to be able to do that work in the time they say so. We don't think they can actually spend that money. So what's the point of thinking you can? Why not use the money for something else? Some of the money on ETCS, we think there's scope for a lot more efficiency, so Network Rail has said. And there's other areas, like there's a project basically to improve Network Rail's telecommunication network along with a private sector partner. Again, really good idea, not arguing about it. Is it really a priority, though, when we've got problems with the core assets? So it's all about that prioritisation. It's all about those judgments, in a sense, at the margin. And that's what we're currently debating with Network Rail. I'm going to come back. So that's PR23. That's sort of looking forward to the next 5 years. I just wanted to come back to where we are now on performance, because performance was declined through the whole of 2022, 2023. It's obviously been affected by industrial action. And you can see as soon as the RMT action with Network Rail stopped, performance has already sort of levelled out, the decline stopped. You can see that effect pretty quick in the numbers. So there's definitely an effect of industrial action. But the question is, despite all these things, despite all the potential problems, what could Network Rail do better? So if you look at the delay caused by asset failures, for example, the primary delay, the sort of regional delay before you get on knock-on effects, they're still about a fifth higher than pre-COVID. If you look at response times to fix, they're still higher than pre-COVID. So we think there's still some scope, there's still something to go for here for Network Rail. Just what's Network Rail's view? Well, Network Rail agrees. Network Rail agrees that they can do more, and that's why they produced a set of plans for each region and from the system operator for freight about performance improvements. A good set of plans, and generally speaking, Network Rail is delivering. I think it's fair to say there are specific issues on Western. That's where probably there's been some most recent problems. I think it's really hard to interpret because you've got a lot more trains running on Western since the Elizabeth line came in. It's a different sort of railway now, and that's no doubt changed the dynamics in terms of just dealing with that. And Western's been hit by a number of quite high-profile incidents. So you could think to yourself, well, occasionally you're bound to get a cluster of them, aren't you? And then you get on for another year or two. Is that the case, or is there something systemic there? And that, I think, is just generally the jury's out on that one at the moment. But going back to the whole system thing, Network Rail still can't do this on its own. And there is a what you might call performance architecture out there, where there's a whole system of guidance, of help, advice, of control, of governance, led by the Network Performance Board to try and do whole system performance. I do think it's fairly safe to say that that's fallen by the wayside a bit over the last year. And that's not been critical of anybody. I think there's been a very big distraction effect from the industrial relations issue. I think people have had a lot to do. You just look at the timetable inside, I think, constant replanning, retimetabling. I think that has just distracted everyone, probably including the ARR, on that. So what we're trying to do with the Network Performance Board is sort of reinvigorate that whole system approach to performance. So what can ARR do to help? Well, what we have done is looked at all the joint performance strategies. This is where you get a train operator, Network Rail, setting together what they're planning to do over the next year in terms of a joint performance strategy. Because ultimately, collaboration is absolutely crucial in this. This hasn't been published yet in terms of the findings, so I'm not quite sure exactly when it is going to get published, but at a really high level, overall, they're pretty good, these performance strategies, but you still see big differences between them. You look at different operators in Network Rail, you still see differences in the quality of the plans. And that in itself suggests there's something to go for, because it suggests there's still, I was going to use levelling up, I suppose that's probably not a good phrase to use nowadays, but there's still a sort of levelling up type effect potentially there in all that. And, we've looked at performance strategy in the past, And there's some really quite sort of basic stuff that was recommended to be included that's still not there in some plans. So why not have a sort of reserve list of performance improvement projects that you can call on if you've got a problem on performance? You don't have to develop them, they're already there. Quite a few plans still don't have that. And so we think there's still something to go there. And I mean that in a constructive sense. The whole point of doing this review is not to sort of put the boot into one particular company and name and shame them. It's to say, look, there's more for you to go at. It's to try and sort of, get everyone to sort of roughly the same point. So we're hoping that's going to have an impact over time. Right, I want to do something, just change direction and talk about something completely different. And one of the reasons for doing this is to try and illustrate some of the things we get involved in that you may or may not be aware of. We are a competition authority, a bit like the Competition and Markets Authority. We have competition powers in the rail industry. We did an investigation into the rail signalling market a couple of years ago. We've just launched last week a new market study. So a market study is basically where we're saying we think there might be a problem with the market, but we're not entirely sure yet, and we're now going to start collecting evidence. So this is on the station catering market. This is your Burger Kings, your coffee places. It's a surprisingly big market. Even if you just take the biggest stations, it's turning over more than $1 billion a year. It's probably bringing Network Rail, I suspect, probably close on 200 million a year in revenues. It's a big, big market, and it affects a lot of people. And you can see quite big price differentials in terms of what's on the station and what's outside. So the question we're asking ourselves, is this market working properly? Is it working for the benefit of consumers, passengers, taxpayers? And we've got a call out for evidence at the moment. And I think these sort of studies are important because so many people are affected by this. It really matters day to day when people are spending money at stations. So we're looking into this at the moment, and we're out for evidence. If you're interested, we've got a call for evidence, which we'll be looking at in due course. I'm going to talk really, really briefly, again, change the topic a bit, about rail reform. So rail reform has been going on. You were mentioning, I think, at least at the start, that I've been doing this job for 4.5 years. It's been going on from pretty much the day that I took over this job. It's been a long-running exercise. We took a decision right at the start that we don't have a stance, we don't have a policy stance on rail reform. Rail reform is a government policy decision. We're an independent regulator. We don't make these decisions. What we do is provide advice, and that's what we've done for the last 4.5 years. We've offered advice and what I would call constructive challenge on this. Where we got to, until quite recently, was if there was going to be legislation to set up Great British Railways, it would involve ORR substantially changing its role. So we've got a change plan to get us to where we'd need to be if Great British Railways was set up. That is looking increasingly likely, and I think that's I don't think that's any secret, really. There's no current planned legislation, even though it's being worked on in the background. We're currently providing advice on non-legislation options. So I don't know where it's going on that, but I do believe there's a slight danger of spending too much time chatting about structures and the structure of the railway. The key issue is, what policies do you want to bring about? If you had Great British Railways, what would it do differently? Because if you identify what you want to do differently, rather than start from the structure, you could ask yourself, well, how much of that could I do with the existing structure, rather than talk about changing the structure? So there's been a lot of talk in the past about, with Great British Railways, you should have a different approach to access. Trains can access the network. Nobody's ever set out what that different approach is. So what exactly is the gain if you don't know what the different approach is? And I'm really firmly of the view that the issue is about policies. If you're worried about revenue growth, and I'm worried about revenue growth, because the financial backbone of this railway was built on year upon year of revenue growth during the earlier part of this century. Phenomenal revenue growth. That's what changed the financial outlook of this industry. We need to get it back. But you can get it back in other ways. You can introduce revenue incentives into the franchise contracts. You don't need to actually change the structure. And my fear is, and I've got no, ultimately this is a government policy decision, but we must make sure we don't spend so much time talking about this, that we don't actually get onto some of the sort of really immediate decisions that we need to take to improve things. Okay, I'm just going to finish off now and talking a little bit about this was that and beyond bit in the title. Just a little bit about ORR. I don't know how familiar a lot of you are with the Office of Rail and Road, but I've been there quite a long time now. When I first started, we were an economic regulator. There was no safety regulation within ORR. The relationship between ORR and HSE was distant, really. There was very little attempt to incorporate safety into any decision-making when I first joined. The integration of safety into ORR was a hugely positive step, and it means we've got more joined-up decision-making. We started off as a rail regulator. We've now got roads. We're a regulator for the strategic road network. We're currently embroiled in some quite difficult debates, for example, about smart motorways technology, so we've sort of branched out. We're also working in Northern Ireland now, which we never used to. So we've changed a lot over time. And we've also rebalanced resources. Now, I'm going to come on to this about the importance of staying relevant. When I joined ORR, we had a huge team taking decisions on which trains should be allowed on the network. And then after a while, you think to yourself, well, do we really need to be involved in this? Is this the best use of industry's time to have the ORR crawling over everything? Or do you just delegate a lot of it out if it's non-controversial? And I think increasingly, we've tried to get out of the non-controversial areas, let people take decisions within a given environment that aren't controversial and save our input for something that is. And that's this bit about staying relevant. You only stay relevant if you're sort of part of the industry. You try and understand what's going on in the industry and you sort of evolve and change depending on how the industry is developing over time. And it's this bit about being part of the solution. So, for example, one of the things we do, and it might affect people here, is that we authorise new trains. We authorise new infrastructure. Now, you can either see that as a sort of technocratic exercise. You know, we sit behind a desk waiting for someone to come in with a plan and we sort of tick it or cross it. We don't work like that anymore. We get out there early and we actually get there talking to people early on and say, what are you trying to achieve here? What's your timeline? What do you need from us? We have a look at things early on and say, to be honest, I don't think that's going to work. We've seen this before. That's not going to work. And we get out there more now. And that's where ORR will increasingly go in the future. We're going to be out there, want to be part of the solution, outward focused, helping the industry, not introspective. And that is definitely a direction of travel. At that point, I'm going to stop and happy to take questions. Thanks very much.
So John will be taking questions from the floor. If you do have a question, please raise your hand, but don't ask the question until you've been passed a microphone. So one's on its way for you. So if you introduce yourself first, please. Yeah,
hello. I'm Bill Free. I work for myself. Looking at the strategic business plans, they're showing a deterioration in the condition of the asset as a result of the spend of 3% and actually higher, particularly in Western from memory. Where you showed your chart of where you thought Network Rail were underfunding things, would that pull it back to a level position? Because they are talking about 10 to 15 years to catch up with underspending in the next 5 years, which isn't a good place, really.
No, you're absolutely right. So if you look at the forecast for the assets are degrading over time. And part of the issue is that we're at a particular stage in the renewal cycle. So the amount of money that's in the system at the moment isn't enough to compensate for where we are in terms of the renewal cycle, in terms of the amount of work needed doing. So even when we shift that money, that will not stop the sort of degradation of the assets over time, which means that we are building up what you might call a further bow wave of more work to do in the future. And that's what you can see, and you can see that from some of the long-term projections. And that's why, when I said it's a good funding settlement, I think it is good considering all the other pressure on government resources. And let's face it, the railways going up against the NHS or something is always going to be a tough competition. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem that we are still seeing assets slowly degrading over time. And at some point, and of course, we're adding to the asset base over time. There's reopening your railways type work adds to the asset base. One day HS2 will add to the operational asset base. So yeah, the position remains difficult.
Who's next? Any more questions? I'll pass it to you. Okay, whilst we get somebody to think of a question, I have one actually. So you mentioned, John, that Network Rail is going to need to prioritise. Levelling up is mentioned in the executive summary a couple of times. Is ORR informing or influencing how Network Rail might prioritise to make sure that there is a fair spread across regions and there isn't a risk of parochialism or one region shouting louder than another?
It's a very good question, and it's one that I'm regularly asked by every MP. in terms of why is the spend in my area lower than everybody else's? Tends to be the sort of general question. It's really, really hard to sort of decide what you might say a fair share is, and that's not really the basis. We're not really doing it in terms of fair share by regions in terms of a levelling up agenda. I know NetRail try and target their spend where they can, but overall we've got to base it on a different set of priorities, which are really around performance, it's around assets, it's around safety, and that does mean you do see differences across the country. And therefore, of course, if you're in one of the areas where you think your spend's relatively low, generally speaking, you're not happy. And I'm afraid that's just an inevitable effect. And people often say, but hang on a minute, you know, I've got sort of X percent of track miles in my part of the country, and I'm only getting sort of X minus 20% of the spend. People use sort of metrics to try and work out how much they should get. But I'm afraid there is no simple formula that sort of says, like, you all deserve this amount. It just can't work like that, I'm afraid. No.
But ultimately, we've got to look at the customer.
I'm afraid it's not a popular
haven't we?
message, but I'm afraid that's the way it is.
Okay, next question.
Hello, my name is Rupert Scott. I also work for myself. And apologies if you covered any of this. I got here a little bit late. You mentioned a study you'd done on sort of competitiveness of catering establishments in stations. And I just wondered if I could raise a thorny issue of competitiveness of actual pricing. So the other day I needed to catch a train from Reading, day return to Warrington for work. And the cheapest I could get was £400. And I personally think that's about 4 times more than is acceptable for somebody either personally or for business to pay for a day trip that's, you know, 100 quid max in petrol. And I mean, if it was 40% more, that would be one thing, but £400 versus what I think 100 would be reasonable, it is just off the scale. And I just wonder whether, as a regulator, you actually get involved in looking at what is reasonable for the consumer. After all, we're doing the same thing for energy and putting price caps in. As I say, the scale it's off the scale, to be quite honest. You go north from Reading to, I don't know, Lancashire, the northeast, it's £400, £500, £600 second class return. I just wonder what your thoughts are.
It's a fair question, yeah. The short answer is no, because largely speaking, the overall fares and fare increases year to year at a high level are set by the government. It's a government policy decision. And it's not really a competition issue in the sense of being a competition authority is for us. So it's not just really in scope of the sort of thing we do. It's more a policy decision. And also, of course, ultimately, there's only 2 main sources of funding for the railway. It's either the fares or it's the government. And that's why at a high level it is a policy choice, the extent to which you put it through fares or you put it through taxpayer subsidy. And obviously at the moment taxpayer subsidy is at a really high level. So the short answer is no. So the focus is very much just on at the moment on the catering market.
Next question, please.
Thank you. Simon Higgins. I don't work for myself, unfortunately. I work for Story Contracting. John, we're a rail infrastructure delivery. We're looking at highways as another industry to move into. Now, with your Strategic Road Network and rail head-on, with rail being a key enabler of route to net zero and the roads perhaps being seen as a disadvantage in that circuit, is there justification to be spending more money on railways at the expense of the Strategic Road Network?
So again, ultimately, the way the system works, and it's set out in legally in an act, the Railways Act says the process is the government decides how much money it wants to put in the railways on a 5-yearly basis. So that level of public subsidy is fixed by the government, and that's set out in legislation. And so, in a sense, whether whether people have a view or there's a case or not, from my perspective, I have to start from that, because effectively I get a number from the government. Now, it doesn't just work like that in the sense that what we do, we provide advice to the government on that level. So what tends to happen, and what happened this time, is that the Department of Transport and Transport Scotland say to us, well, supposing we put in this, what would happen? Supposing we put in that, what would happen? You know, what would be the impact, going back to the assets point, what would be the impact on assets, etc.? So it does tend to be a long discussion, but ultimately it's within certain parameters, because frankly, the government's funding is under a lot of pressure, and we see it across the piece now. So Railways has got its 5-year funding settlement. The roads funding period is 1 year afterwards, so it's a 25 to 30. The roads funding discussion is really, really hard right now. And the main reason for that is because of High Speed 2. High Speed 2 is now big enough to exert an influence over the entire Department for Transport spend base. And so the discussions about the Future Roads programme are exceptionally complicated at the moment. So no, I mean, the short answer is no, but it is interesting seeing the rail and the road thing together and seeing how well the process works on each of them and seeing where it's better or worse. And we do sort of feedback on that. And indeed, we get feedback as well because people say, didn't it go faster on railways? So it's actually, I think it works really well, actually. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Anyone have any more questions? There's one here.
Hello, Tony Lee, Anaplan. John, I've heard in the past you've talked about a single P&L for the rail industry. Are there any? Can you just outline the key barriers that would stop you having that single P&L to help investment
P&L,
ideas?
profit and loss.
Yeah.
No, you're right. Absolutely, there has been a lot of talk about that, and indeed one of the things we do each year, we do what we call rail industry financials, where we try and put the train operator financials alongside the network rail financials on an annual basis, and that's on our website. But it's not quite a single P&L; it's more an aggregation of things. So one of the ideas behind Great British Railways is that it would allow you effectively to come up with that single P&L. You could internalise the train operators and the infrastructure within that. But obviously that depends a little bit on what's going to happen about Great British Railways, which I don't know. Having said that, what we have seen some analysis of is at particular route levels or particular parts of the network, an attempt made to try and do a sort of semi-integrated P&L, and then to see, well, hang on a minute, what's actually driving costs in the system. That's not been done across the whole country really, but it's probably happening more now because every train operating company goes through an annual business planning round, and quite a lot of efforts are made to try and link that to Network Rail's business planning round. So I would say it's more, we're doing more than we did in the past, but I don't think we're anywhere near that sort of full single P&L would be my best estimate. But also, see, we can help a little bit on that. So, for example, we're going to have a performance fund in Scotland, which we've agreed with all the parties up there. It'll be within Network Rail's pot of money, but basically the idea is that the projects could go to whichever gives you the best improvement in performance for a given pound. So what's your best bang for your buck? So if it turns out that doing something to the train, putting cameras on the train, actually delivers a better performance improvement, then that potentially could be paid for out the fund. So, we're doing things at the margin, but I think we're some way off what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay. Question down the front here.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. Apologies, I missed most of your speech. Toby Lackliffe, West Midlands Rail Executive. Given where we are as an industry at the moment, I mean, we've got reform coming, whether it's got legislation or not. We've got restructuring of some shape or form coming to Network Rail under GBR. There's a lot of focus on cost reduction, a more efficient railway, streamlining of processes. But what I've not heard much about is, does that give an opportunity for streamlining of regulation and potential savings there? And what's your take on that as the regulator?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. And you'll be pleased to know the Treasury asks us that question every year as well, in terms of, because with what we found with the Treasury, it's always better to volunteer the savings up front because, Jim, it's just cutting to the chase. If we're requiring Network Rail to make efficiency savings and we don't propose any to the Treasury ourselves, we're going to look pretty exposed, really. So there's efficiency savings on a business as usual basis. The actual, if you look at our spend, what governs that is really often what government wants us to do. So our spend's gone up partly because government's asked us to become a roads regulator, and that's added, 3 million to the budget. So a lot of it depends on the things that we are asked to do. If Great British Railways is set up, then it's been decided that we will become a regulator for the whole industry. So we will regulate the whole of Great British Railways, and that will take us into areas that we're not currently involved in. So for that whole system performance thing, we would have greater powers in that. But that's a sort of yes or no decision, really. So what we have is an agreement in principle with the Treasury. If it happens, we will change our capabilities to deliver this, and we'll get some extra money to do it. If it doesn't happen, we won't get anything. And it tends to, therefore, our funding tends to be sort of done in that sort of way. It tends to be in sort of decisions with the Treasury because, I mean, interestingly, we don't we negotiate directly and only with the Treasury on our funding levels. Department for Transport has no sort of input really, apart from some parts of the road side. So it's very much a one-to-one negotiation between us and the Treasury, and it depends really on what they think we should be doing in the rail. So, for example, they're very interested in the competition work, because they think it's got overall economic benefits, but we've also discussed areas where we scale down activities with them and just said, look, we don't think we need to spend any more time on these things. And if you look at where we've reduced spend in some areas, it's just areas where we feel we don't have to have a role, which goes back to your point. You know, what's the point of the regulator being involved here? What I tend to find, though, is actually a lot of people do want the regulator involved, and particularly on things like authorisation, say, because they think it can speed up their process. And that's the sort of conversation we have with the Treasury. It's, it's a tricky negotiation.
Thank you. That has to be our final question. Are there any final points that you would like to make, John, before we close the session?
No, thank you. No.
Okay, so thank you everybody for taking part. As I say, the draft consultation was launched last week, and everybody can respond to that. The deadline for that is the 31st of August. There's a dedicated inbox for that as well, which we can share the link out to. But thank you very much, and fingers crossed for more efficiencies and better managed assets.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.